Hello, very beautiful community. Welcome to this question and answer session about the state of our civilization. Now, you let me know if there's a problem listening, hearing, and seeing. And if there isn't, I'm going to do a little bit of what we usually do, which is scroll up and honor the people who left questions at the beginning. I'm going to do a reach for my tea now. Hang on a second. Now we're well armed now. Just going to check you're seeing and hearing me, and I'm going to jump right into the question. Okay. Jan is asking, AI, generative AI, what is its impact on culture, both through the use of AI art and the slow replacement of human relationships with chatbots? So my relationship with AI does not significantly hinder me, but I use it in a very special way. I use it either for factual information, that's to say, how many years during the 20th century were Labour in power in Britain, or I use it for questions where I'm gonna already know if it's bullshitting me or giving me the wrong information. And that often is very useful to engage with, let's say, ChatGPT on areas where you're already very, very well informed, because you know that you're not going to be led astray. You can use what it gives you without getting used by it. I mean, let's run a test. Give me something on why we in the beautiful community can't accept that democracy is in decline from a post-Kleinian perspective. Let's see what we get. Waiting. Okay, so loss and mourning. To admit decline is to face the loss of an internal object. Splitting. We keep good democracy and bad politics separate, preserving a pure image of democracy. Manic reparation. Idealization of community, fear of psychic fragmentation, on and on. So I'm going to give this like 3 to 4 out of 10. I mean, this is not good, but it's not terrible. It could remind you of something you haven't remembered to include, for example, in your thoughts. So that's an example of it being useful. What I do is that I keep meaningful personal communication out of ChatGPT. I think that's very important. So even if I'm writing a long letter to somebody, which is almost never going to happen because of my health, but if I am writing a letter to somebody, I am not going to put it through ChatGPT ever, no matter how ill I feel. I just won't write it, because there'll be something sacred there that gets violated. So I suppose we can generalize about part of it like this. Since 2000, without ChatGPT on hand, we've already lost a lot of our capacity for comprehension. We're a lot less good at comprehending what is in front of us, and all too good at reading into it what we want to see there, or reading into it what the surfaces of that text in front of us imply. We look for buzzwords, you know? So for instance, I tweeted something about um, the pros and cons of tightening the regime on Russian visas in Europe. And most people on Twitter X who are pro Ukraine would just look at it and say, does this sound like a pro Russian thing or does it not? If it doesn't, then great. If it sounds like a pro Russian thing, I'm going to do something negative. I'm going to write a mean comment below. So, algorithmic thoughtlessness without comprehension. So, that will be accelerated by interactions with chatbots. Absolutely. Because what we're going to get from them is what we want to get from them, and we'll ourselves become like the thing that we want to get from them. You're seeing somewhat similar patterns in terms of how you're conditioned by algorithms on social media apps. But that's to say that we're going to be drawn to when these things give us something that satisfies our more immediate and superficial wishes. And then we're going to go on as though our immediate and superficial wishes are more central than they really are. That's a fragment of it, but certainly there's significant risk there, and there's a conversation to be had there, both of a personal kind and about how we go on as polities. Gregory, do you feel the sickliness and fragility of our culture? I'm a young Russian. I feel if Europe weren't so sick already, it wouldn't have lost us. And now that we're somehow doomed together. Now, I am now so happy, yet I can't feel some kind of grief. And this grief somehow alters my happiness, makes it very detached. Grief, real grief, is a form of connection with the world. So there can be such a thing as constructive grief, as well as unconstructive grief. Which one do you have? There's a real risk of extrapolating onto culture what has political explanation. Russia's severance from Europe has more of a political than a cultural explanation. There's a cultural explanation too, but it's centrally political. So what we don't want to do is take the politics out of it and just perceive it as something that's to do with cultures drifting further or closer away from one another and clashing. So it's important that there's a lot of politics in what you're asking. There's going to be a lot of politics in the answer to the question you're asking. And we can't do without it. Otherwise, we engage in the kind of nuttiness where all political issues become about sort of cultural swishes coming and going. I mean, very roughly speaking, given that we've titled this Western Civilization, and whether it's in decline, a very interesting feature of Russian culture is that Russia's high culture is very Western, but Russia's culture in its entirety is less Western. It's not non-Western, but it's clearly less Western than Russia's high culture, which is entirely Western. Russ, social relationships are becoming more like parasocial relationships because social interactions happen and appear largely in the same space on people's phones, thoughts. Well, don't forget it's also going the other way. Parasocial relationships are becoming like social relationships. People begin to treat um, folks they have parasocial relationships with as though they had a social relationship with them. I mean, for instance, look at the number of people, well, I see it, you don't, who feel enormous ownership over what I'm doing, as though um, anything I do needs to be negotiated with them. And so when I do something they don't like or they find boring or not interesting, they can't believe it, um, because they feel a certain kind of ownership. Um, and very often, when you put um, a person who has found themselves in that place, which is actually to a degree most of us, um, with somebody who actually has a social relationship with that person, that can go very, very weirdly, because the person who doesn't know the person with whom they have a parasocial relationship will talk about them as though they do know them to the person who actually does know them. Um, I do think that patterns of attention are leaking from parasocial to social relationships because they're on the same device. However, this is affecting children the most. So we have a real challenge around this kind of blurriness when it comes to kids. I personally don't experience this at all. Um, my social relationships have not changed in the last 10, 20 years because of the presence of apps on my phone. I do like something, which is that I do like to somehow keep apart um, social apps like Twitter from texting apps where I connect with people I love. I somehow do my best to keep these apart. I even keep them in different folders on my phone. And I don't like mixing them all together too much. But quite certainly, there's 74,000 sociology theses to be written about this seepage. Um, Echelon, hey Vlad, you talk quite a bit about depoliticization. I'm starting to wonder whether a broad helplessness is more accurate as a description of what's going on with us in general. So, depoliticization is a designative concept. It's not an explanatory concept. When I tell you, here go depoliticized Russians, here go depoliticized Canadians, I'm not telling you exactly the social explanation of what is happening to them. I'm just saying that they are either somehow ostracized from politics, or more plausibly, they are relating to politics in a non political way. But how one relates to politics in a non political way depends. There are many ways of doing that. And so, what form of depoliticization takes is then going to be something we have to diagnose and give an explanation for. So, depoliticization is just a tag for a plurality of social modalities, if you like. All of which manifest the same result, that people are either not doing politics or doing politics without doing politics. But this can work in very many different ways. And once we explain that, that explanation is then going to be populated by 77 different things, of which a kind of learned helplessness might be one among others. There is a lot of talk in Visible Poor about Western civilization being, there was a lot of talk about Western civilization being in decline in the interwar period. Was it true then? And how and why did it recover? I don't believe that Western civilization was in decline in the interwar period in the way that makes that label useful. What was happening was a series of breakdowns, some of which were ones we could adjust to, others were ones we couldn't adjust to. Now, I don't mind if you want to call that civilizational decline. Now, one kind of breakdown occurred, obviously, around the continuation of the dissolution of a sense of a cosmic order. And what that meant isn't that nobody any longer believed in a cosmic order, but it was that um, most people didn't mostly believe in a cosmic order any longer. And the people who believed in it, at least relatively more so than others, were still affected by the fragmentation and by the breakdown. That's to say that much less of political life, much less of cultural life, much less of how you relate to your um, partner, your children, your parents, your neighbors, your fellow citizens could be read off from the cosmic order of things. Um, Now, the degree to which you could read it off the cosmic order in 1820 is far greater than the degree to which you could read it off the cosmic order in 1920. A very important question arises that Nietzsche put front and center in the 19th century, at the beginning of the 20th century, and that is whether or not to keep civilization going, to keep our societies going stably, we might not need to believe in things that we can no longer take entirely seriously. Right? We're still living with that question today. Is democracy not dependent on us believing in values that we've questioned to such a degree that we can't take them seriously anymore? There is then something, of course, about the peculiar reflectiveness, the peculiar historical self-consciousness of the modern world. That as a result of which we kind of became um, artificial. Right? There's a fear that we kind of became artificial because we've come to occupy an enormously historically self-conscious world, a very reflective world, which means that a lot of the um, pillars that oriented us previously around what was good and what was beautiful have now come into question. That in turn generated enormous liberatory uh, tendencies. Don't underestimate how much liberation there is in this fragmentation. Don't underestimate how much liberation there is in postmodernism. Don't underestimate how much fragmentation and liberation there is in the collapse of tonality in music. One way to feel yourself into humans in the early 20th century is to look at the breakdown of tonality around the time of the First World War in classical music. So I think whether you frame any of these things, of which we could put more on the table, as civilization decline or not, I don't know. Now, some of the same things we're still dealing with, but only on a greater scale. But also, we've got particular challenges that they didn't face back then, and some of our challenges around fragmentation politically, I think were not quite present then. Of course, another thing that we should say is that a human in 1920 expects many more of his or her wishes to be realized than the human in 1820. There's a completely different relationship with a sense of entitlement about life, if you like, servicing you around authenticity, right? You expect life to accommodate your distinctive attitude to how it should go for you in 1920 in a way you don't in 1820. Hi, Vlad. Uh, Yevgeny is saying, what is Western civilization? Malin Baker, my beautiful YouTube friend, give a shout out to yourself if you watch Malin. Hi, Vlad, famously, when he was asked what he thought of Western civilization, Gandhi said it'd be a good idea. An early hit on common hubris. How can we define the topic to be meaningful? Well, we mentioned Nietzsche, Malin, and Nietzsche would say that nothing which has a history can be defined. But very roughly, the question of what Western civilization is would be about who we are, where we've come from, and where are we going, and who the hell is we in this equation? Well, it would be humans who are in a meaningful historical way, beyond just the fact of historical derivation, in some meaningful historical way, connected to ancient Greece, connected to the Romans and Roman jurisprudence, connected to Latin Christianity, connected to the Renaissance, connected to the Reformation, connected to the scientific revolution, connected to the Enlightenment, connected to the counter-Enlightenment, connected to some of the fragmentation we've briefly touched on in the 20th century. Insofar as that story goes, what you're left with is a certain kind of designative sense of what Western civilization is, that you certainly can't define, but you can think of it in terms of a degree of historical continuity that is deeper than just derivation, deeper than just A coming after B, and then B coming after A, rather. It's that A influences B significantly, that B wouldn't be what it is if it not for A that came before. Having said all this, there is, of course, a very big difficulty with taking this designative definition too far, with non-definition definition too far, because everything is connected in the modern world. If we ask a question of a certain kind in Paris, there's no reason why it can't be asked in Nuku'alofa in Tonga. So in a certain way, there is a limit to how far you can say that something is Western and something is not Western in a world in which the possibility of confrontation between different cultures is ultimately available, ultimately real. You can talk in a sort of purer way about cultural units if they are ones that can never meet for historical reasons because they're very, very far apart historically, or because they share historical proximity but don't share geographical proximity. That's to say, there were societies many centuries ago that couldn't communicate with one another. Well, that's not the case today. And therefore, to some degree, we have to say that our conversation about what the West is not just designative, it is also invitational. You can no longer, in the modern world, say that certain questions are asked in Europe, but then they can't be asked in China. Well, that's just not true anymore. Now, so that's one important qualification about the interconnectedness of the modern world. Another important qualification is that, shush, smartwatch, is that we shouldn't confuse things that are a matter of human nature with things that are a matter of a particular cultural expression, right? So we also want to be careful there, because there are certain things that are sometimes labeled Western civilization that are, in fact, not far from being universal human goods that can just be differently expressed in different cultural circumstances. So that's the beginning of it, but you're never going to get a definition. How do I have a good relationship with women as a man? It's worth doing a video about this because there's a real crisis of men. But I'm not sure how much I can say now. It is a topic I'm very interested in, and it's a topic where I'm observing a lot of calamity happening. A lot of men are freaking out that they can't partner, and a lot of women are freaking out a lot for different reasons that they can't partner either. And so we do need to talk about this. One of the things that's really important to understand is that you can be deceived about what you need to be by the self-help culture. One of the risks here is that the self-help culture will sell you a bogus version of being a kind of alpha male, which is in fact a way of being a beta male who just happens to think entrepreneurially and go to the gym and have routine. Um, so, um, you know, be careful about that. But I think one thing you need, of course, is to be grounded in your masculinity. And to be grounded in your masculinity means having a healthy relationship with your masculine and with your feminine side. A true masculinity is a masculinity that is not intolerant of its feminine side. We have a very, very big cultural problem around that, and our self-help culture is not helping here. But that's the beginning rather than the terminus of this conversation. Waffle. A few years ago, you made a video about Dostoyevsky in a godless world and what that meant. Can I ask you, what would be your own view on the accuracy of his idea on morality and religion in relation to culture? Um, I think that one way to understand what Dostoevsky meant when he said, more or less verbatim, that if there is no God, everything is permitted. What he meant by that isn't obviously the idea that you can't have ethics without religion, because Dostoevsky is not an 8-year-old, right? He's a serious grown-up. You know, forgetting that he's a literary genius. So he's obviously not going to think something that facile. But what he thought is that certain dimensions of our ethical life were unavailable to us unless we believed in God. And the dimension which was unavailable to us, he thought, was the dimension of absolute prohibition, such that there are certain things that you would never do, no matter what the circumstances are. And the implication is that a much more empirical, if not indeed utilitarian culture, would always have available to it the question, well, why not do this bad thing if we feel on balance lots of good things will result from it? And Dostoevsky would say, no, there are certain things you just absolutely never do, no matter what benefit is going to come from them. And the sociological extension here is that a culture without a sense of absolute moral prohibitions can't healthily survive. Is Dostoevsky right? I would be inclined to say that he is wrong, but it's important to say that it's actually up to history to deliver us the answer. Gaffer Bob, I can't catch this, but thank you. Thank you so much too. Let's see how we're doing with super thanks I may have missed. Rachel, how do you compare the current MAGA war on science and Stalin era Soviet Lysenkoism in terms of how pervasive and destructive each is? Well, roughly, Stalinism was about, at least at times, the destruction of scientists physically. Trumpism is about the asphyxiation of our capacity to tell the difference between what is legitimate expertise and what isn't. And that's blurred not just in virtue of various kinds of post-truth communication, but in terms of an attack on institutions such as higher education institutions. Here we've got a post-truth, somewhat fascistized right project, really heavily defined by what I would call a kind of monarchist ideology. With Lysenkoism and Stalinism, you're in the realm of a very modern Enlightenment ideology, which says that certain things need to be aligned to have the kind of societal transformation you need. And one of those is that it ought to be brought about that there should be no conflict between party and expertise, between party and science. But the theory there would be that eventually it should work out that there genuinely is no conflict there. So you're potentially temporarily engaging in various acts of destruction, but down the line, the idea is that a naturalistic understanding of the world is something you're actually in favor of. It's just that properly set, it's not going to conflict with the project of the party. Now, there is also, of course, there a certain idea of the spiritualization of technology, a certain idea of revolution through technology, which in some ways, funnily enough, for all of their massive differences, 20th century fascism and Soviet communism shared. So I see more disanalogies than analogies there, probably, I think, on balance. Quite a lot more disanalogies than analogies. Catty list, hey Vlad, just wishing you strength. You're an excellent communicator. Well, since my health declined in April, I've actually got less good as a communicator, but I'm still improving as a public intellectual. But that's not inherent. That's just because when I feel more physical symptoms, I speak less fluently and I say a lot more. I'm aware of that. Thank you. David, how is wokeism become hyper-identity politics beyond the mere example of identity politics? Is Trumpist hyper-neoliberalism a sort of endpoint of neoliberalism? I want to distinguish between hyper X from another X. I'm not sure I'm completely following, but I'm going to try. So identity politics is something you cannot live without in the modern world. Right? There are certain modes of group belonging that are just part of who we are as modern humans. And the idea that you should abstract these away from politics, as for instance Jack Rawls wanted to do, is just completely unrealistic. It's a tyrannical denial of who we are. But there are constructive and there are unconstructive modes of group identity politics. There are many different kinds of unconstructive modes of group identity politics, most of which are not woke. What wokeism is a very, very special 21st century Western phenomenon that's happened in some Western countries much more than in others, which is at core, at least sociologically, a bid by certain professional classes for social recognition and indeed even professional elevation. And then the form it takes is this very sick form where you convert the political into the moral, which you should mostly not do. Most political disagreements should not be thought of as core moral disagreement. You convert the moral into identity. So you don't just say, well, we disagree about taxation policy. You say this is a very core moral disagreement, because it means that if you have a different view on taxation, you are erasing certain citizens from society. And then this becomes about identity. So my opposition to somebody's bad view about taxation is not just core moral opposition, but it just is an expression of who I am. And so the very fact that they disagree with me about politics becomes an attack on who I am, which is a total calamity, because what happens is that all political conflict um, becomes an attack on who you are, potentially, which just means you are not a political animal anymore. You've depoliticized yourself completely, which is why in the West, wokeism and hyper-identity politics has gone all too well with the obliteration of centrist and center-left politics. And then there is the further step where you say, well, not only is this about my identity, but institutions I belong to ought to protect my identity. Well, the problem is that there are plural identities, and you're asking for institutions to protect one rather than another. What in fact should be happening is that this should be a matter of constructive political conflict, out of which certain kinds of compromises arise. But what's often been said is that my group's rights aren't just rights, they're human rights. But of course, human rights can't ever clash with any other claim. Human rights do need priority. So that means anything I ever claim politically, I must always get. But that's not a position of somebody who wants to live in a society. And that's why, um, particularly uh, young generation folks in privileged urban centers and privileged higher education institutions are so shrill and incapacitated today when it comes to engaging in political conflict constructively. What I would say, however, is that wokeism is dying. It's depleting year by year by year at a fairly rapid pace. It'll be just one of those fads that comes and goes. It won't be there 10 years from now. And one of the real deleterious consequences of it is that all of the bits of social progress for Black people, for trans people, for women, on the basis of wokeism will collapse. And therefore, these groups will need to be, if you like, re-advocated for again, because the things that sustain the different bits of their elevation of their status in society, the things that sustain their elevation will crumble. And we will need to re-justify them. And so one of the important social justice projects for the next decade in the West is how do we retell the story about various kinds of systematic disadvantage and exclusion of various groups, uh, but no longer base it on wokeism. And the problem we've got is that the post-truth authoritarians will just tell us no. They'll just say, aha, you tried this already and it was BS, you're trying it again. But the reality is, it's not BS this time. We're just seriously saying, look at all of these important forms of structural disadvantage. That's a very important challenge. You've got to be very courageous in standing up for the rights of the different kinds of groups that wokeism try to elevate, but do so constructively, and call bullshit on the authoritarian right people who will accuse us of being woke, right? Because we've now reached a stage where 98% of anti-woke discourse is BS. It's not anti-woke, it's anti-democracy, or it's anti-solidarity, or it's anti the idea that every citizen belongs. So we're in this very difficult dynamic. The question of neoliberalism and hyper-neoliberalism is separate. What I do claim there is that there is a relationship of, if you like, potentiality for a historical lapse between neoliberalism and hyper-neoliberalism. That neoliberalism, which is a culture of putting magical primacy on the free market, always has a propensity to lapse into a kind of ugly politics of might is right. Russia is the most extreme example of that lapse. That's why the anarcho-capitalism of the early 90s in Russia is not just connected to Putinism in virtue of historical derivation. It's also connected to Putinism in a richer causal way. To some degree, it's a case of one thing being born from the thing that preceded it. So I'm not saying that all neoliberalism automatically becomes hyper-neoliberalism. I'm saying there's a structured risk, and certain historical circumstances then materialize that risk. I don't remember seeing the movie Idiocracy. Or if I have, Rachel, I've forgotten it. I'm sorry. How can we eradicate conservatism as an ideology in the same way that Marxism was annihilated in 1989? Sadly, it seems conservatism is immune to failure. Just look at Putin, Trump, and Bibi. So, Mario, you don't want to eradicate conservatism. First of all, you're a little bit conservative yourself, right? No matter what your ideology is. Conservatism is part of all of us, right? The most hardline socialist is going to be a little bit conservative because there are several major ideologies in our culture, or ideological pools, or pluralities of ideological pools. Socialism, liberalism, conservatism are just three. There are more. Now, each of us is impacted and is under the shadow of all of the major ideologies in our culture. So to eradicate conservatism is just an intelligent idea as to chop off your toe. It's a silly idea. So what you want to do is stand in your ideology, whatever that is, and it's not going to be any one thing if you're honest with yourself. It's going to be complex. And also understand the ways in which you have constructive tension, constructive conflict, but also some receptivity with conservatism. Moreover, we desperately need conservatism in our culture today because what we've got is a collapse of conservatism. Putin, Bibi, Trump are not conservatives, they're revolutionaries. They're the opposite of conservatives. So what we've got is a world in which there are so many people claiming to be conservatives who are in fact counter-revolutionary authoritarians in conservative clothes who need to be called out. There is nothing conservative about Tucker Carlson. There is nothing conservative about Vladimir Putin. Very little, indeed. I'm exaggerating, but this is to make the point. So what you want is to focus on constitutional conservatives, conservatives who believe in maintaining the rules of the game, right? And therefore are not undermining democracy. So find these conservatives and conflict with them constructively. The conservatives you really are opposing here aren't conservatives at all. They're what I would call ex-conservatives, authoritarians in conservative clothes. Even Marxism didn't die in 1989 and will never die. I mean, not for the foreseeable future, let's say several centuries, right? There's no chance that Marxism can die in the next 200 years. Yeah, it's impossible. So you're going to coexist with that ideology in this world. If you want to be rigid, you won't be able to empathize what pulls people into it. If you're going to be more pliant and flexible, you're going to realize what pulls people into it. The more pliant you are, the better protected, if you like, you will be in your ideological stance. If you're very rigid, and your question is very rigid, then you're going to have a self-persecutory relationship with other ideologies, right? You're going to have to pretend to yourself that they don't influence you when they do. You're going to have to pretend to yourself they're not, in fact, just ways of human beings answering in a different way to you questions and pulls and pushes that are acting on all of us, but to which we respond in different ways and so on, right? So there's such a thing as being ideologically beautiful. And being ideologically beautiful is about receptivity to other constructive ideologies. You don't need to be receptive to completely destructive ideologies or destructive elements of other ideologies. So there's a difference between conservatism and fascism, for example. Enough said for now. What is sacredness? That's an extraordinarily important question. And I'm probably not going to dare answer it today. So let me cop out and say something about something relatively trivial, which is sacredness in politics. Sacredness in politics is about several things, one of which is the idea that certain things are so precious that it's not just that they shouldn't be taken away, but that the very raising of the question of taking them away is already harmful to, let's say, democracy. Too much mushroom. Is it me, or has there been a dramatic overnight change in the atmosphere aura, for lack of a better term, since Trump and the populists won? It feels like social attitudes common from the 1950s are returning. Yes, it has had a huge disinhibiting effect, and that's inevitable. Lots of things that are unlovely have been normalized. A lot of destructive impulses have been normalized. Now, you might say that also certain things that should have been put into question have been put into question. But overall, are you right that it now feels more normal to say an authoritarian society could be a good one? Yeah, that it feels more normal to say that a society that definitely excludes certain groups from participation in the fruits of the society is also more normal. Yeah, unfortunately. So there's a kind of a real disinhibiting effect. And what's very challenging is that it's difficult to put that effect back in the box. Once it's out, it's out. And so every time, a day passes in our current environment, it's going to become harder and harder to move all of this toward even partially being put back into the box. How relevant are Marshal, McLuhan, and Neil Postman today, considering the changes in media? Um, I'm not an expert here, but I would say that um, relevant with the understanding that we're in an environment that folks from the past couldn't entirely anticipate, and it has its own distinctive qualities. Love your channel. What do you think of the historical influence Thatcher's had on the UK? Was something like Thatcherism inevitable even without Thatcher? Great question. Maybe too political for the purpose of our chat. Um, if you take it very, very loosely, then you could say something like Thatcherism was inevitable. But you would need to take it very loosely. There was a lot wrong with Thatcherism. And Thatcherism did a lot of damage. But that's a big conversation. Another important part of this conversation is, of course, Thatcher was a pro-institutional politician, and so we should never allow ourselves to equate Reagan or Thatcher with the post-truth authoritarians of today, except via an account of how neoliberalism can lead to hyper-neoliberalism, how primacy on the market can lead to a politics of might is right. I do think Thatcherism probably needs a separate conversation, and we'll get there.